So, as some of you know, the original goal that Sarah and I had in creating this colloquium was to bring together UCI urban planning students and engineering students who are interested in transportation planning, basically to facilitate informal dialogue for sharing and understanding different disciplinary perspectives about the ongoing revolution in mobility. So we're thrilled that in recent years, the colloquium has expanded beyond UCI to attract the attention of graduate students at additional campuses, as well as professionals at various agencies. And while the colloquia have had an emphasis on mobility equity, our colloquium today has a special focus on transportation equity and inclusiveness and environmental justice. So for the first part of the colloquium, our featured speakers have submitted video presentations, and several of the speakers will be available in person to answer questions at the conclusion of all three presentations. You can submit a question via the Q&A button um, in Zoom. I believe it's at the bottom of the Zoom screen, the Q&A button. So after that, we'll then move to part two of the colloquium with a panel discussion moderated by Sarah Katz with our two distinguished discussants. So without further ado, let's get started. Joining us for part one of today's colloquium are three of the most esteemed leaders in transportation. And we're delighted that our first speaker is California State Senator Lena Gonzalez. And Senator Gonzalez, by way of background, was first elected to the state senate in 2019. As state senator, she represents nearly 1 million residents in Southeast LA, Signal Hill, Lakewood, portions of South LA, and her hometown of Long Beach. She was recently appointed the new chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, becoming the first Latina to ever serve in this capacity and the only woman to serve in the last 20 years. In February of this year, Senator Gonzalez was also appointed as Majority Whip, one of 7 Democratic leadership positions in the California Senate. Let's roll that video, Jared.
Hi everyone, this is State Senator Lena Gonzalez, proudly representing Senate District 33, which includes Long Beach and Southeast Los Angeles. And it's a pleasure to be with you all at the UCI Irvine Transportation Studies and SANDAG Consortium. And it's also a pleasure to speak with you today about an issue that is very close to my heart, the issue of equity. I think equity is a huge concern for our transportation system, as well as our society more generally. We should start by acknowledging that lower income communities have been disproportionately harmed by the COVID-19 pandemic. They've suffered the most in financial losses, many have lost jobs, and some have the additional burden of dealing with housing insecurity. This makes dealing with transportation equity especially urgent. So let's start with transit. We know that most transit riders in California are low income. The average annual income of LA Metro's bus riders, for example, is less than $18,000. Making transit better is one of the most important things we can do for equity. We need to give those riders better service so they can get to and from where they need to go more quickly, efficiently, and of course more safely. To improve transit, we'll need to be creative and employ new technology. A good example are the many trials of on-demand service, either like first mile, last mile solutions or a shuttle-like service run by the transportation agency. These services can be flexible and convenient and are really a promising solution. We also need to think about equity when to consider how to pay for transportation. Much of public transportation, as we know, is paid for locally, often through sales taxes. But increasing sales taxes to pay for transit is only saddling low-income households with bigger burdens. Another way to pay for transit and transportation more generally is congestion pricing. But there also needs to be a lot of care and consideration in the implementation of congestion pricing so that it doesn't disproportionately impact lower income communities. I'm also asked about additional state general fund revenue for transportation projects, and I'll always be a champion for those. And clearly there's a need. But there is a lot of competition for those general fund state dollars, and surpluses, as we know, are rare and irregular. So we can not only count on the state's general fund to provide consistent and substantial funding for transportation. We need a sustainable long-term financial solution that comprises of all these forms of funding, and more importantly, transit options that are convenient and efficient for all those who need it to ensure we do not leave anyone behind in California. Another issue has to do with the movement of freight. My Senate district in particular includes the Port of Long Beach, and the main rail and highway routes leaving the port go through the heart of my district. And my district is actually 70% Latinx, with 20% of my residents living below the poverty line. The goods movement has a very big impact on my constituents and on equity more generally. We need to clean up the emissions from the ports, from the ships and on-dock vehicles, and we must reduce emissions from the many diesel trucks which service the ports and drive up the 710 freeway, as well as the trains which take the freight and move it to other regions of our state, as well as other states in general. This is something I'm actively working on, and this year I am proud to say we successfully passed SB 671 to help California transition to cleaner freight vehicles. Climate change is the biggest overall challenge to disadvantaged communities. It may well be an existential threat. More extreme weather will impose new costs and impose new harms. An example is the cost of adapting our highway system to sea level rise. Current estimates are that it will cost over $10 billion over the next 10 years, and we haven't budgeted the funding to pay for it. We're going to have to figure out how to adapt to climate change and to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that our transportation system emits if we're going to protect our disadvantaged communities from harms they cannot afford. There is so much work to do, but I thank you for inviting me to speak with you virtually today. Equity and transportation equity is so important and such an issue that we need to prioritize, and I'm pleased that you're all engaging on it. I look forward to the day when I can speak with you all in person, which I hope will be sometime soon. I hope you're all staying safe, and thank you so much for this conversation about equity and transportation again. Thank you.
Okay, well, our thanks to Senator Gonzalez for those remarks. Our second speaker will be LA Metro Chief Executive Officer, Stephanie Wiggins. And in May of this year, Stephanie joined LA Metro as the CEO. She heads that agency with 11,000 employees, manages a budget of nearly $7 billion, and oversees up to $20 billion in capital construction projects. Prior to joining Metro as Chief Executive Officer, she was Chief Executive of Metrolink and the Deputy Chief Executive Officer previously of LA Metro.
Greetings to everyone attending this year's consortium hosted by UCI's Institute of Transportation Studies. I want to thank Sarah Katz for the invitation to speak to all of you about social equity and social justice issues in transportation, a topic that has been talked about by many globally in the recent year, especially as we all try to get back to some sense of a new normal. I will also talk about some of our Measure M projects and our plans for the 2028 Olympics and how some of you, upon graduation, can possibly work on some of these projects we will be working on in the next few years. So when I came back to Metro in June earlier this year as a CEO, during my first 100 days, I did a listening tour. I visited every bus and rail division and talked to as many employees as possible, including our vendors and our customers. I also rode the Metro buses and trains and spoke to some of our riders. I asked them to be honest with me. I wanted to know what people's concerns were, whether it was safety during COVID-19 or issues about frequency and routes. As you can imagine, some of the responses I received were complimentary and others not so much. It was particularly important for me to hear from people who are still been riding our system during this pandemic. And while many former riders are working from home or found alternate modes of transportation, many did not have those options. From hospital and service workers to people with limited money and few mobility options, approximately 363,000 people continue to ride Metro at the height of the pandemic last year. They rely on Metro to get them where they needed to go. I also wanted to know how to improve their experiences because solutions that support those with the greatest needs usually help all. One of the complaints I heard from many riders was that the buses were too slow. We have our bus rapid transit routes that make limited stops about every mile, And those buses are also equipped with special sensors that sync with traffic signals. So this means if a bus is close to an intersection and the signal is about to change to yellow or red, the signal will wait for the bus to get through the intersection so the bus doesn't have to stop. This program greatly improves the bus travel times and improves reliability. For this program to be successful, though, we must secure agreements with the cities we operate in. Another way we can speed up our bus service is to have dedicated bus-only lanes installed along heavily traveled corridors. And our great partnership with the City of Los Angeles and the LADOT has proven successful on this front. Over the last year, during this pandemic, we now have dedicated bus-only lanes in and around the downtown Los Angeles area that really have provided us the opportunity to increase the speeds and reliability of our buses. We are always striving to prioritize bus movement through congested areas. Why is that? Well, the majority of our riders don't even have access to a car, so we are a lifeline to them. And for that effort, towards that effort, we now have a new state law that was just signed on October 8th by Governor Newsom that we hope will keep those buses operating in bus-only lanes moving and traveling on time. AB 917 was sponsored by Assemblymember Richard Bloom, who's a former council member for the city of Santa Monica. This bill helps keep our bus-only lanes open during peak travel hours and not blocked by illegally parked vehicles. AB 917 allows our buses to be equipped with cameras on the front of the bus to enforce parking violations in bus-only lanes and at bus stops. So currently, we have about 29 miles of bus-only lanes. And while we are looking to increase the number of miles, it doesn't help when the lanes are constantly blocked. During peak travel times, one illegally parked car in a bus lane delays a bus about a minute. But on the bus, there can be 80 people. So those 80 people have been delayed an extra minute. So the average person will say, okay, 1 minute, not a big deal, right? But some operators tell me that sometimes they encounter up to 15 cars blocking a bus-only lane in 1 hour. So this means the bus and the 80 riders on board can be delayed 15 minutes or more. Now, a 15-minute delay may cause someone to be late to school, to miss a medical appointment, or even worse, to lose a job. We have lots of buses traveling on the street during peak periods. What if there were 60 buses traveling on the street during one peak travel hour? That one illegally parked car will have delayed 4,000 to 5,000 bus riders. Think about the potential impact on all of those lives. With the passage of AB 917, violators will receive a warning citation, so they won't have to pay a fine for a period of time. But the goal is, hopefully with one warning, it will change the behavior where they will not park in a bus-only lane. Another example of really being intentional at Metro is advancing gender mainstreaming. And that is to recognize that people experience our system and services differently based on their unique characteristics, including one's gender. In 2018, Metro did a study called Understanding How Women Travel. Now, before this study, we really lacked extensive data on how women's usage of our transit differs from men on the Metro system and what improvements might make their experiences better. Through the study, we found that women ride the system more, often have different travel patterns, they make shorter trips, multiple trips, and they face some unique barriers to using the Metro system. There were also differences among women based on income status and race and ethnicity. We were able to identify areas for potential policies, improvements, and service changes. And as you would imagine, the report confirms something we already knew, that women felt unsafe using Metro for a variety of reasons. Lighting at bus stops at night was one of the more common concerns, and as a result, we are addressing this now. Another issue that came to our attention was that many women tend to use the bus more between peak travel hours. And as a result, they had longer wait times because bus frequency is often reduced during the off-peak. Well, we have since increased the number of buses operating during the midday period to decrease waiting times. And guess what? We've seen an increase in our ridership as a result. We also have started a gender action plan that will help guide us to make other customer experience improvements for women. One other concern that I'd like to talk about is how transit agencies around the country are concerned about whether or not their ridership will return to normal, especially since many people will most likely continue to work from home as a result of the pandemic we've all experienced. At Metro, increasing ridership is something we've been working on even before the pandemic. Still, we recognize that ridership is not the only measure of success. How we rate as far as quality, safety, affordability, and accessibility matters just as much and clearly impacts ridership. So in addition to making sure that our riders return to the Metro system, we focused on our riders' ability to afford public transit, given that many people may have lost their jobs during the pandemic. While we have some of the lowest fares in the country, the cost can still be a burden to some families. So we have developed some programs to make traveling easier for students and low-income families. Our hope is that they use public transit. One of my goals is for everyone, beginning with young people, to choose Metro as their first option when considering their mode of transportation. So one program we have underway is our Fareless System Initiative, or Go Pass, for students at participating K-12 schools and community colleges. With Go Pass, students can ride Metro without the worry of paying a fare. They can ride it to and from school or for trips after school and on weekends. We are also seeking the input of young people to make this a system they are proud of and one that they want to ride and are personally invested in. We plan to engage them by asking them to apply to join the first ever Metro Youth Council to evaluate the perspectives of young riders in the conversation about our future. One other fare reduction program we have to help people ride Metro is our Low Income Fare is Easy, or LIFE program. It's a fare discount program for low income riders over the age of 18. Now, this is not a new program, but we have recently made changes to streamline the application process and have increased our marketing efforts. We want to make sure that a greater percentage of people eligible for the program actually are able to enroll and use it. One other way we hope to attract new customers is to convince drivers to get out of their cars and use public transit. To do this, we need to expand our service area and offer viable options and effective modes of travel. So I've talked about AB 917, gender mainstreaming, and fareless transit. So what do they all have in common? They all are examples of advancing equity at Metro. So why does Metro focus on equity? Well, first, I imagine many of you have seen this. Let's say this picture represents the need for access to healthy food from a grocery store. The apple is the store. The blue boxes are transportation options. The differences in the size of people represents the differences in their financial situations, physical ability to travel, proximity to grocery stores, and other things that impact their ability to get to a store and buy groceries. Metro controls their mobility options and must make sure that they are equitable so that all have a chance to get there, no matter where they live, their income, or their race. This means some will need more blue boxes than others. If we look to the average person or general needs and give everyone the same thing, we run the risk of perpetuating existing disparities. If we focus on those with the greatest need, however, those that fare the worst will be able to understand how to help all. That's what equity is about. This example works at the individual level for housing, jobs, park access, and other areas of opportunity. And the Transit Center's Equity Dashboard published this summer illustrates this opportunity. Black residents in the LA region have the least access on transit to jobs and hospitals, and white residents have the worst access to food stores on transit. And drivers can also get to hospitals, pharmacies, grocery stores, and universities 2 to 4 times faster than transit riders. So now think back to the AB 917 example and how important that new law is in advancing equity. So why is Measure M important? Earlier this month was our 5-year anniversary of its passage by 71% of LA County voters. Well, according to that same Transit Center report, LA is a region where a car allows for 17 times more access to destinations than transit. 17 times. Another finding is that the biggest disparity is between car owners who can access, on average, nearly 2.9 million jobs in a 45-minute trip, versus transit riders who can only access approximately 170,000 jobs during that same time period. So projects like our Purple Line subway that are funded by Measure M are so critically important to closing that accessibility gap. There are many Measure M projects under development, and we are excited by the confidence in the voters to deliver those projects. Just to give you an example of the magnitude of the Measure M program, there are 55 projects currently underway with a value of $21 billion. And the local funding through Measure M totals approximately $66 billion for a variety of transportation improvement projects over the next 4 decades and beyond. Another major upcoming event that we are planning for is the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games. And as some of you have probably heard, there's a 28 by 28 plan on the table, meaning that we have 28 projects that we want to complete by 2028. This is an exciting time. The organizers of the games want to make the games car-free for spectators. So that's an incredible opportunity to showcase our public transportation network to help people get to both the Olympic and Paralympic Games. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, you could possibly work on Metro's projects. If this is something that interests you, we would encourage you to explore career opportunities at Metro. We provide paid internships and have a successful transportation associate program, which are entry-level positions for recent college graduates. I know I've talked about how we are building projects for the Olympics and Paralympics, but realize that we aren't going to stop building in 2028. We currently have projects that we are planning for the next 40 years. We are going to need engineers, analysts, financial analysts, planners, artists, people with marketing and communications backgrounds, lawyers, you name it, we're going to need it. So if you are considering a career in transportation, consider joining Metro. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks to Stephanie Wiggins for her remarks. We're going to move now to our last speakers, and they will be Hasan Ikhrata and Jane Clough. Introduce Hasan first. He is the Executive Director of the San Diego Association of Governments, also known as SANDAG. And SANDAG is the leading research, planning, and transportation agency for the San Diego region. The agency builds consensus, makes strategic plans, obtains and allocates resources, plans, engineers, and builds public transportation, and provides information on a broad range of topics pertinent to the region's quality of life. Hasan has over 30 years of public and private sector transportation planning experience in our region. And as Executive Director of SANDAG, he directs day-to-day operations of the agency and implements policies set by its governing board. Joining Hasan today is Jane Clough. Jane is a Senior Regional Planner with SANDAG, as well as the Tribal Liaison. Jane has worked on this year's regional plan and is the project manager of the 2021 Regional Plan Social Equity Working Group.
Good afternoon, class. My name is Hasan Ikhrata. I'm the CEO of SANDAG, San Diego Association of Governments. It's good to be with you this afternoon. Very shortly, you're going to hear a detailed presentation from Jane Clough, our staff. A little bit about SANDAG. We're a metropolitan planning organization, a regional transportation agency that does planning for the whole San Diego region and the 3.3 million San Diegans. We have a vision for the future. We're reimagining the future of transportation system. While the car culture dominated us in the last few decades, it's proven to be not the right strategy for everyone. Therefore, we established a data-driven process, a process that takes social equity and social justice seriously, and moved forward the vision that we believe at the end of the day it will be fairer, safer, and cleaner for everyone. Why social equity and social justice? For a long time, transportation committed sins against low-income and minorities. And it's time for agencies like ours, who have the authorities and the power and the know-how, to make sure that these sins never happened again. And moving toward the future, we do everything possible to make sure our transportation system for the future is equitable, because access to transportation is access to opportunities. Good to be with you today. And with that, I will now turn it to Janet Clough, our SANDAG staff, to do the rest of the presentation. Thank you for having us today.
Thank you so much, Hasan. As Hasan mentioned, last year we presented to the SANDAG board and this region our vision for the future of transportation in San Diego County. We showed what it means when you create a system that truly works together across all modes to support intentional land use. This slide shows the vision coming together. That is the 2021 regional plan. We have taken our vision and made it a reality. We have shown ourselves, the state and the nation, what is possible. A system that works for all its users, a system that recognizes that equity, access, and connections are deliberate choices about where and what our infrastructure looks like. A system that gets us where we want to go in a way that makes sure we will still have those places to go to in the future. It's an unprecedented investment in our region, a system that works for all of us and provides cleaner air for all. In a nutshell, this is the 2021 regional plan. It's a pairing on-demand, right-size options, high-speed rail, smart managed lanes, and better transit, with intentional land use that form neighborhood hubs. It's a way to meet today's challenges and prepare for tomorrow's opportunities. This plan also meets important state and federal mandates for social equity and the environment. The plan will preserve more than 4,500 acres of open space, or 3 times the size of Balboa Park, which is our central park, so we and our children can enjoy the natural beauty of our local environment. And it will do all of that while significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions to improve local air quality and support regional climate action goals. As part of the planning process, staff has been committed to centering its work through the lens of equity. To advance the goal of providing a fair transportation system, a regional social equity planning framework has been developed in partnership with SANDAG working groups by presenting it to different audiences and considering best practices in equitable planning. Through this process, we've identified 5 interreliant actions that form the basis of the SANDAG regional social equity planning framework. This includes data accountability, how we use it, and how it informs our work. Measuring impacts, understanding both the benefits and trade-offs of our plans, programs, and projects. Prioritizing investments, a topic area that had important and thoughtful board discussion around funding and prioritization of investments within our underserved communities earlier this year during the development and adoption of the equity statement. Monitor, report, and evolve, ensuring we commit to an ongoing monitoring and reporting process to evaluate the actual benefits or negative impacts of our work. And last, but certainly not least, engagement, ensuring an engagement process that is transparent, fair, and inclusive, and leads to empowerment. These 5 actions rely on continuous learning. We must be open and adaptable to how we approach, incorporate, and prioritize social equity in our plans, programs, and projects. This framework has been used in the development of the 2021 regional plan and will continue to be used, refined, and enhanced throughout its development. Critical to our equity work is our social equity working group and our social equity partner network. The CBOs, or community-based organizations that are in our environmental justice communities, are trusted messengers in their respective communities. They have the capacity to convene, and they assist in removing the language barriers that often are happen with communities that are not used to being involved in the process. And they serve as cultural liaisons with these communities to make sure that their issues and concerns are integrated into the regional plan. And even before the plan proposed adoption, SANDAG has made a commitment to equity by providing funds for free transit for youth 18 and under as a pilot program to launch in 2022. The ideas, concepts, and passion for ideas, such as the youth opportunity passes, come from our communities. SANDAG engages with community members to ensure that we develop a plan that helps them to get from where they are to where they need and want to go. San Diego sits in a very unique regional position with various land use partners within and surrounding us, including the tribal nations. Critical to the equity and outreach discussions, our tribal government partner are our tribal government partners. Through a government-to-government framework, SANDAG has engaged with them throughout the development of the regional plan, integrating our tribal partners' needs into our plans, programs, and policies. The social equity analysis within the regional plan looks at several impacted populations within our region: people of color, low-income populations under 200% of poverty, and our senior population 75 and over. And communities impacted by poor air quality, as shown in the red and orange colors in this map, which comes from the CalEnviro screen. As you can see, the areas with the highest concentration of underserved populations have significant overlap with areas that have poor air quality. This slide shows our three social equity focused populations. The map on the left shows our communities of color. The map in the center shows our low-income populations, and the map on the right shows our senior population. Putting in place the proposed network, you can see that it improves access for our underserved communities, giving them true mobility options. One of the obstacles to economic and social equity in our current transportation system is that not enough people have reasonable access to an alternative to driving alone. As mentioned before, there's a significant underserved population in the San Diego region. Across all underserved populations, only about 1 in 10 people have access to an alternative other than a vehicle. As you can see in the chart here, in the 2021 regional plan, it triples access to the alternative forms of transportation in the region by 2035 for all of our underserved populations. These numbers continue to improve through 2050, the horizon year for the plan. The blue dots in this map represent our region's colleges and universities, junior colleges, and vocational schools. Educational attainment is more important to our communities of color and to our low-income communities, as shown in the yellow and orange dots on the map, for economic success than ever before. Increasingly today, more jobs are requiring a skilled and more productive workforce, which creates a growing need for college-educated workers. Currently, only about half of these groups can access higher education within 30 minutes on transit. With the proposed investments in the regional plan, we provide more competitive transit options to higher education institutions, which continues to improve by 2050. In addition to the transportation investments, There are supporting programs and policies proposed in the plan that address other equity considerations. These new investments include things such as the transit fare subsidies for low-income and youth populations, and housing grant programs to encourage new affordable housing in mobility hubs, while also ensuring our investments do not lead to displacement. There's so much more for the 2021 regional plan. We have developed a data viewer that's in English and in Spanish online, which you can check out even more details on the projects in our region. And you can also scan our QR code to learn more on San Diego Forward, sdforward.com. Thank you so much for this for listening to this presentation, and we'll be here for questions and answers. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to Hasan and Jane for their remarks. I believe Hasan is here in person to answer questions. So if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A button. And I'm now going to hand things over to Sarah Katz to moderate the remainder of our colloquium.
Wonderful. I want to wait till I see Hasan. I saw him for a second. And meanwhile, could my students start with some Q&A in the Q&A box? I do have a couple questions here that I've received. Hi, Hasan.
Hi, Sarah, how are you?
Good, how are you? Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you and Jane for your remarks. Your leadership is just beautiful.
Thank you.
And I have a few questions already for you, and I think my students and others are putting more in the Q&A box.
Sure.
But I mean, as you're well aware, VMT has become quite a controversial topic. And from our readings, no region has yet to do a region-wide congestion pricing system. Is San Diego considering this? And then what does that also mean for equity outcomes?
Great question, Sarah. It's good to see you as always. You're one of those who I consider my go-to if I get into trouble. And so I probably will tell you that this region will be probably the first in the country to say we're going to do congestion pricing, we're going to do it right. And if you're following the media in San Diego in the last couple of weeks, you hear a very political debate about the road charge fee, and you hear about privacy talks, etc. And so I want to tell your student here and tell all of you that yes, we are putting a plan going to the board next month that would include a replacement of the gas tax at the state level. In addition, a local fee of 2 cents per mile on top of that. And some people say, well, is this because you need money? And the answer is no, not necessarily. Yes, of course we need money, and local funding sources are important, but it's also to manage congestion, also to reduce greenhouse gas emission, also to understand that the best way to pay for something is based on use. If you use it, you pay for it. We believe that very strongly. Now, what does it do to equity? And as you know, Sarah, I'm really big on this. This has been a personal journey of understanding for me the impact that transportation did over the few decades in the past, and how we divided communities and we didn't really care oftentimes of all the impacts. I believe congestion pricing, if not implemented right, is going to impact low-income and minorities more than others. But I also could make this argument that if you're a low income today, you're most likely to be driving a car that consumes more gasoline than if you are in a higher income category, or if you're driving a Tesla. And therefore, even with the gas tax, there is the regressive nature of that tax that the low income and minorities pay more. I believe any system moving forward in the future of congestion pricing have to find and figure a mechanism where we guarantee that low income and minorities are not going to get hurt. And there is ways to do that. There's many different ways to do that, by either giving a back voucher or by limiting the charge in some cases, because I believe if we don't do that, we're absolutely going to lead us to even more inequitable transportation in our world.
Thank you for that great answer. A question for you. I've seen Ford's recommendations to the DOT on how we get to mobility for all. How do you see SANDAG's regional plan via these recommendations?
Well, look, the SANDAG plan is really, if I were to describe it in a couple of sentences, I would say it's a data-driven, multimodal, equitable transportation for all people that we represent, the 3.3 million of them. The first one is data-driven, and I hope that I will say to everyone that looking at planning, make sure that data drives your decision, not politics. You should go where the data takes you. And we made a great deal of investment in making sure the data, especially the new sources, the cell phone data, are used to arrive at the strategy. Second, this plan is not about forcing people out of their car and putting them in a different mode. This plan is about making sure that people have choices that are priced right. Because if these choices are not priced right, it's not going to work. And finally, like we said in the beginning, in the past, when we looked at plans and we said, let us make sure we meet Title VI, the environmental justice requirement of the federal government. This is all about checking the box. Saying, oh, can we meet it? Check the box. And checking the box meaning that we're all equally impacted, negatively or not, nobody cares. And I'm saying this plan is not just about checking the box. This plan is about making real changes to how we provide transportation, because access to transportation is access to opportunities. If we want people to move up in their income and their lives and their ability to have better futures, we have to provide access to transportation. So I think our plan, like the Ford to the Nation, is exactly about that. And we are true to what we're saying. And the plan is not adopted yet. I can tell you, Sarah, right now, I never counted vote, but things are looking very interesting how it's going to go down.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, when it's adopted, hopefully after next month, I will say this region did something that no other region did before.
I hope I'm congratulating you by then.
Thank you, Sarah.
How much more time do you have? Because we have quite a few questions.
I will be with you as long as you need me, Sarah. You know.
Beautiful, thank you. Do you see autonomous vehicles as an opportunity for business and mass transit in general?
Absolutely. I believe the future mass transit is not going to be the mass transit of 30, 40, 50 years ago. I'm going to give you a couple of concrete examples. So Sarah and I are familiar with the Metrolink system in Southern California. The Metrolink system at its peak was carrying about 50,000 people a day, coming from Ventura, San Bernardino, from Riverside, from Orange into LA, and vice versa. That system ridership went down to about 1,000 when the COVID hit, and almost zero. And now, even after things opened up a little bit, it's down up to 11,000. Now, the question is, will we ever get to 50,000? I don't know the answer to that. And I think it would be dangerous to formulate public policy based on this period. But that model of building a commuter rail to bring people from the suburb to downtown is no longer the model that's probably going to be true in the future. So does that mean we don't need transit? Of course not. We need it more than ever, but we need the kind of transit that fits a new model of life for us. A flexible, we called it in our 5 big moves, the flexible fleet, an app-operated, on-demand service. That is the future trend. And autonomous vehicles is going to be a big part of that. Autonomous, electric, shared fleet is the future transit fleet. That doesn't mean that the fixed guideway system is not going to be needed. In some cases, it will be because the densities are there to support it. We're building about 200 miles of subway lines in San Diego from the South Bay to bring them to Sorrento Valley and beyond. And I believe we can justify that fixed rate. But the most of us, will we want a flexible vehicle to be available to us like our own car? And if we can provide it in such a way that it's also available to someone else, it's in its own guideways, or it's driveless, I think it will be the more the better. So the future transit system will absolutely be different, and being autonomous is going to be part of it. Now, there's a big debate about when that autonomous is going to be there. I can tell you right now, we just released a request for innovative concept last week. We put it out to the world. We said, give us your idea of a fixed guideway system that's shared, electric, and driverless, autonomous. Mainly 14, 15 miles of tunnels underground that connect the landmarks in San Diego, connect to the airport. And I am looking forward to hearing from the industry, because we're not only asking them to give us ideas, we're telling them we're going to put tens of millions of dollars on the table to partner with you. Once we pick the 2 or 3 firms, we're going to say, we're going to be your partners. And Sarah, you and I know that some of the companies, whether it's BYD, the Boring Company, the Glide Company, they're all about innovative ideas. But we're as SANDAG partnering with them. And if it's a fixed guideway, it's easy to have driverless. Technology is available. The problem with autonomous anywhere else, it has so many variables to control for. The broadband and the urban form and the way it's designed, is it safe? And so the debate about when we're going to have all autonomous, nobody knows the answer to that. I don't think it's going to be in the next 10 to 20 years. I think we're going to see going toward autonomous, but for mostly fixed guideways, not for overall. Will we ever have a disruption in the technology like we did in the cell phone and others? Possible, yet to be seen. But autonomous will be part of our future planning for sure, whether we like it or not.
I agree. You and Jane gave a great discussion of the regional social equity planning framework. Is that fairly unique to SANDAG, or are other transportation agencies also coming up with such a substantive plan? It's really impressive.
Go ahead, Jane, and then I'll follow Jane.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Jane. I didn't see you earlier.
Yeah, well, certainly other MPOs in the state are also, working on social equity. Everyone understands that lifting all boats is going to make us all better. But our program is I think very innovative, and one of the things I was going to add to what Hasan said, that even as we're developing the different programs with flexible fleet, for example, the flexible fleet strategy, we're actually working with the community-based organizations and the environmental justice communities, our network, to actually craft the flexible fleet strategy, and we'll be instigating a pilot project in one of those communities. So this is about working together and working from the ground up to make sure that the policies that we develop are really going to support those communities.
Sarah, we're not unique. Obviously, other transportation agencies. What our uniqueness is, I think we adopted an equity statement last January, and just last month we had our board put an $11 million for transit-free youth passes. So we're trying to say to our elected leaders, yeah, you passed a statement, it sounds great, it's written here in my wall, but let us follow it up with action. I think we're probably the first agency to start saying, okay, we're going to follow these statements by actions, and I hope other agencies will follow suit.
Yeah. And I think, with Hasan's leadership of having the youth transit fair, it was Hasan's leadership in saying, we're going to find some money you have all these requests in terms of how you would like to see early actions, but we want to put it in your hands to figure out what are the priorities. And so the social equity working group actually put together the proposal and looked at all the alternatives and weighed all the pros and cons for the best benefit for the budget that was made available. And I think that's incredibly unique, and the board passed it. So
it's wonderful. And several of the questions you all have pretty much answered some of it, but I'm going to, if you want to add anything to it. It's absolutely great to see your organization having projected programs and changes to deal with accessibility for low-income residents. What is your organization doing at this moment to help low-income and communities of color have greater access to transportation at an affordable price?
Great question. As we started, we are doing the pilot for free bus passes. We're proposing to our board that by 2030, all transit be free in San Diego. So we have a congestion. The congestion fee is going to be used to make sure we have a system that works. We are really keen in making sure that we don't leave the low income and minorities as last when it comes to investment. We're actually starting environmental and design for the very basic transportation services that should have been here decades ago. We're doing all of that right now, and we're saying we're about to go for a major regional transportation improvement program amendment, $200 million, to take the money and put it in the right place to help low-income and minorities. So we're serious about this, and so is our leadership.
And what are you, or how are you gathering civic support for your initiatives?
Let me say that I haven't seen anybody in any position, elected or otherwise, stood there and said, I don't care about equity and I'm going to oppose equity. I mean, you get, of course, pushback on congestion pricing, you get pushback in revenue sources, you get some discussion on that. But I believe this agency have done a great job in the last year or so to make sure that equity is not just a discussion where politics and policy collide and that's that. This is a discussion where politics and policy intersect, and policy wins at the end of the day with the logic. And I think our civic leadership in this region is ready for it. I also want to caution that, look, we have a history of inequitable transportation. We have a history of the sins of the past. We're not going to overcome it in 1 year or 2 or 3. It's a journey, like it is a personal journey for me, learning about this issue. It's a journey for us as a society, as Americans, as professionals, to make sure that any change we push forward is not just to get the slogan or the headlines of the day. It's just for truly making an impactful change on serving the community, especially low-income and minority communities.
And just a follow-up to that, are there any public outreach? I mean, I'm sure there are, but what kind of public outreach or informative campaigns are being developed?
Significant. So Jane, you can go through some of those.
Yeah, so we have a social equity working group that's made up of community-based organizations from all of the environmental justice communities in the region, and they meet monthly. And they're sort of the core of then making sure that the word gets out. We also have at a general level, a lot of work that we're doing in different areas, making sure that people are understanding the regional plan and are aware of what we're doing. But the social equity working group, every piece of significant elements come to the working group, like we said, with the pilot project for the flexible fleets, the transit program, as we're developing affordable housing program. It'll all come through to the social equity working group so that they can weigh in on how these different programs are going to impact their communities.
Fantastic. One last question. How do you plan to convince drivers to be comfortable with congestion pricing? Will there be a price index where very low income drivers pay little to nothing while high income drivers pay full price, or? What?
So that's probably a key. So that's where perception and reality are two different things. Most people would say, hell no, I'm not going to pay a fee. Most people will say, you're going to violate my privacy and you're going to follow me and I don't want. And these are all really perceptions. Sarah, you know that the technology is there today without violating anybody's privacy to figure out how people pay the fee and get into who are the low income and who are not, so they are not hurt by it. The technology is there. What's not there is this fear mongering that goes on because politicians are eyeing to gain political points, score political points by acting like we really care for you and therefore we're going to fight congestion pricing. When in fact, congestion pricing is good for all of us. For all of us, low income, high income, middle income, and congestion pricing is a fairer way to pay for transportation. And look, you know, the professor in me comes out now. So I teach kids like yours here. And I can tell you that the most important thing I could teach kids is make sure you pay attention to the facts and then make your own judgment. Don't listen to a politician trying to, position themselves for a political point at the expense of the facts. The fact is congestion pricing is a much fairer way to deal with this. User-based is a much fairer way. It's actually easier to identify the people who's going to be hurt for it so you can subsidize them than right now. There is no mechanism for that. How do you convince them? Obviously, we're going to continue to outreach and have a public education campaign. We're going to continue to look for leadership. You know, I'm fortunate for me to say, but there isn't a lot of leaders who's willing to stand up for what's right in today's politics. We're such a partisanship society that it's hard to have a conversation, even an intelligent conversation about these topics. But I'm hopeful, I'm an optimist. I think there will be leaders and those leaders will be willing to actually upset somebody. You know, remember, I think you probably heard me say that, Sarah, before. Steve Jobs says, if you want to please everybody, go sell ice cream. Don't lead. If you want to lead, you're going to make some people mad, but at least you will stand for what's right. And I believe, I'm an optimist. I think there's going to come a time when the fact is going to win and the truth is going to win, and people will be more accepting. Now, you talk about privacy. My daughter drives a Tesla, and she comes, plugs it in to charge it, and goes watches Netflix movie. And the next thing, because of that, Netflix know that you're watching, and they're offering her something. Is that privacy? I mean, did my daughter get bothered by that? That every time she charges her Tesla, but because it's government, and I understand that people are scared. Says my privacy. Nobody's going to violate anybody's privacy. This is sacred for us at SANDAG. No, I will never ever recommend any program that even got remotely to violating people's privacy. But we need these campaigns and these facts to be the case and do a lot of public outreach. But I think our people will come eventually and understanding and accept.
Very well said. Thank you so much, both to Hasan and Jane, for giving us the time and for your remarks earlier, and for all the good work you're doing. Really appreciate your compassion and your leadership. So thank you.
Thank you for having us, Sarah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
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 We are now going to go to part 2 of the colloquium. So we need to promote our next speakers. And I think while we do that, I am going to read you their bios, if that makes sense. I am really excited. There's Joe. I am really excited about part 2. I think it's going to be very thought-provoking, and I'm looking forward to the questions. By the way, for those of you who wrote questions for the other speakers, they were not able to hang on, so I will get your questions to them and hopefully get you an answer fairly quickly. So I'm going to, we have 2 panelists. I'm going to read both of their bios, and then they will each have remarks. We'll wait for Q&A until after both of them have given their remarks, if that's okay. So our first speaker is Joseph Demento. Joe is a distinguished professor of law and of business, transportation science, and planning at UC Irvine. His areas of research and teaching are urban planning and land use, and international and domestic environmental law. He is the author or co-author of 13 books, including Changing Lanes, Visions, and Histories of Urban Freeways, Environmental Governance of the Great Seas, Law and Effect, and Climate Change, What It Means for Us, Our Children, and Our Grandchildren. He has written and lectured on urban freeways extensively and written case studies of several. He is a board member of the UCI Law Center on Land, Natural Resources, and the Environment, and the Newkirk Center for Science and Society, which he actually directed for 9 years. Joe is also known, or we refer to him, as the professor that wrote the book about the divisive impact of US urban freeways on urban communities. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our second panelist is Jennifer Hernandez. Jennifer has practiced land use and environmental law for more than 30 years, and she leads the law firm of Holland & Knight's West Coast Land Use and Environmental Group. She is the only California lawyer ranked by her clients and peers in Chambers USA in the top tier of both land use zoning and environmental lawyers. In addition, she was recognized as the top environmental litigator of the year by Best Lawyers and received a California Lawyer of the Year award from the State Bar of California. She's also received numerous civil rights awards for her work on overcoming environmentalist opposition to housing and other projects needed and supported by minority communities. And this is the coolest part. Former San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown, during his tenure as mayor of San Francisco, named October 9th, 2002 as Jennifer Hernandez Day, in honor of her work as a warrior on the brownfields to restore and redevelop former industrial lands. We truly have two of the most brilliant minds with us today, and as I've said earlier, I've asked them both to make remarks. So Joe, if I can turn it over to you, and then when you're done, Jennifer will make hers.
Thanks so much. What a great pleasure to be with you, Sarah and Steve and my old friend Jennifer. You said brilliant minds, but this brilliant mind, so-called, isn't capable right now of sharing my screen. And I wonder if somebody can help me do that, unless you received a copy of the PowerPoint that I sent. It kept coming back. I, of course, can proceed without it, but the logistics, the graphics assist me with this presentation.
Jared, can you let him share his screen?
Yes, I opened, yeah, he can start to share his screen just by clicking that button. Do you see the share screen button?
Yes, and then, thank you, Jared. Then what do I press?
You just choose the screen you want to share.
Yes, and that's Microsoft PowerPoint, and it says Open System Preferences, Security and Privacy to grant access.
Just choose your PowerPoint.
Pardon?
Choose a Microsoft PowerPoint and then click Done.
I won't waste people's time. I'm not getting very far with this. I am on PowerPoint, and I don't think you're seeing anything, are you?
No, you have to go to the Zoom panel, and there is a share screen button at the bottom.
Which panel, Jared?
The Zoom video panel. The Zoom video panel.
Right. That's what I've been on throughout.
And do you see a list of buttons, in the bottom of the screen?
Yes, and
one of them says share screen. So
I've done that many times, and a white screen appears, and on it is several different options.
Right, yeah, then you should choose the screen you want to share and click share.
Yeah, that's not what's happening.
Do you want to, you can send the PowerPoint to me and I can share it for you.
I tried that 3 times and it kept coming back. Again, I don't want to waste time.
So what I'm
Maybe-
thinking is maybe you can make it into, save it as a PDF and send it to Jared. And in the meantime, maybe Jennifer can make her remarks.
That
Does that
sounds like
make
a
sense?
good idea.
Jennifer,
yeah.
are you ready? And do you have Jared's email? Joe?
I do,
Okay.
but
Okay,
again, it kept coming back, so. I don't
Yeah,
know.
so I'm gonna have the same issue. I did send my PDF to you, Sarah. And so I don't know if you received that, but I will try to call up my screen. And maybe it'll work. So did that work?
I see yours, Jennifer.
Oh, shocking. Okay, then we can just go ahead. Let me go to the from the beginning slide.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much, Sarah and team. It's a real pleasure to join you. I am not going to have the same messages that you have heard. And I think Joe and I will also not be on the same page, at least with respect to several of these points. I do commend everyone for taking a real honest look, really for the first time in the mirror over really the failure of the transportation academic and professional people, all experts, none who wake up and say, oh, what kind of cool racist thing can I do today? I know, let's shut down another bus line. I'm confident, you know, that level of intent was not there, but I don't think we can really dispute the consequence of really decades now of bad transportation planning. And I don't share the view that Hasan offered optimistically that, you know, this time we're going to get it right. In fact, we're already getting it just dramatically wrong. And I'm going to share with you a few slides I did from an article, a journal article published this past summer called Green Jim Crow. And it's a provocative title because the thesis of the argument is that really through some environmental dogma that emerged initially in the 70s, and then it's been hypercharged by climate advocates. There's really this very strong kind of anti-growth, anti-change. There's too many people in the world kind of perspective. And that perspective has blocked the housing, transportation, and other infrastructure that people who weren't around owning their own house in 1969 need. And those people are younger and browner. And the deprivation for those people of housing and transportation solutions that actually work is foundationally racist, and it continues today. And I should disclose that I have, on behalf of my civil rights clients, sued both the California Air Resources Board and the Office of Planning and Research for some of what we think of as the worst of today's racist environmental dogma. And that continues. So with that intro, I'm going to give you an incredibly fast, what can people afford? In California, teachers, nurses, firefighters, I'm using a sort of middle income public employee sympathetic job classification, but I can also extend that to families like the one I grew up in. I'm the daughter and granddaughter of steel workers from Pittsburgh, California. You heard that right, Pittsburgh, California. We used to have this whole kind of manufacturing sector of union jobs and what I think in all honesty would be considered lower but still middle class families who bought their own home. and were able to raise their kids. And then those kids, like me, were able to attain the next level of upward mobility with education and hard work and the usual stuff. We've choked that off in a very big way. And one of the very big reasons we've choked that off, that pipeline off, not the only one, but one of the really big ones, is we have systematically refused to build housing in locations and of a typology that people, families can afford. What do I mean by that? This is a quick slide that gives you a very basic overview. I'm a philosophy major, so everything I say is going to be pretty basic, of the cost of building. The cheapest thing we as human beings know how to build in terms of housing is stick-built wood, single-family, small homes. We grew up in a 900 square foot, 2-bedroom home with 1 bath. That is not an expensive home to build. The next most expensive, almost the same, just a little bit more, is small lots, right? You use less land, you're spending less on land, and you still have pretty small homes. This example is 2,000 square foot, but these per price ratios hold. Then you get to attaching them on the side, townhomes or row homes. That's a little more expensive, actually. It's almost twice as expensive, but it's still pretty feasible. Then you get to townhomes where you're stacking homes on top of each other. And now life gets complicated. Now you have to actually figure out how different ownership or apartment models work with multiple stories, elevators, much more expensive systems. And then from there you go to mid-rise, and now you're 3 to 5 times more expensive than that first 2 categories, single family homes. And then you get to high-rise and you're 5 to 7 times more expensive. Our building typology preference for higher density, transit-dependent neighborhood development has led us into the townhome to high-rise range of products. That's what transit likes. It doesn't like having to run around single-family neighborhoods. There's not enough ridership, which is one of the many reasons we don't have good ridership in California, with some exceptions. You know, San Francisco's 49 square miles, great transit. But when you build high density, what you do is make it unaffordable for people. People, median income families, depending on the county, $60,000 to $80,000 a year. You're supposed to spend about 1/3 of your income on housing. What you can afford is $2,000-ish, $2,025-ish, $100 on a mortgage or an apartment. The rental strike prices that you need to actually make the townhome to high-rise pencil are closer to $4,000. And $4,000 for a 1-bedroom apartment is simply unaffordable. And then people complain about, you know, luxury housing. I get it. I mean, you know, $4,000 for a tech bro in the Central Valley or in the Silicon Valley is not that expensive because they're making $130. $4,000 for a 1-bedroom apartment for a working family is unattainable and overcrowded. So we have a problem, a structural problem with the transit, environmental, climate regime's insistence on fixed route public transit and building density near fixed route public transit. And it was not surprising, but I don't know that we heard it all, that people can get to 17 times more destinations, jobs, in a half an hour by car in this region than by bus, 17 times. If you have to be in the job to be paid, if you don't have the luxury of sitting at your keyboard or playing with your phone, but you don't get paid and you lose your job if you're not there on time and you're not there every day, you're not taking transit. And lower income residents and workers fled transit pre-COVID. And there's terrific analyses of this by UCLA and USC. It's not me. I've used the data in our civil rights lawsuits. It's one of the many reasons we spent a whole lot of time getting undocumented immigrants access to driver's licenses. And it's a huge issue in the country to have access to a car. Going back to, you know, the welfare reform of Clinton and what's his face, the other, I won't say the other idiot, but I just did. But when we really reduced welfare rolls during the Clinton administration, there were lots of studies done. And, you know, oh, you got to be in a high opportunity neighborhood. Oh, you got to have this or that support level. No, the people who did the best in transitioning out of welfare were those who owned a reliable car. And you can get a reliable car because, at least pre-COVID, you can't kill, as far as I could tell, a Toyota or a Honda or whatever. And you could get it for like $3 or $4 grand, and you would get it and you would nurse it along. And that's how you got your kids to school. It's how you got to groceries. It's how you got to jobs. And by the way, we're talking 2 or 3 shifts, not in a central business district, as many households have more than 2 jobs per household. Long Beach is one of the locations that we looked at pretty carefully in our civil rights litigation. This was an effort by SCAG, Hasan's colleagues to the north, for the Southern California Association of Governments region, including Orange County. And it was a land use map done by transportation aficionados who were very focused on reducing vehicle miles traveled. And you reduce vehicle miles traveled by putting people in high density housing near transit, right? Obvious. Look at what happens when you apply that planning principle from a land use perspective to Long Beach. On the left side are the locations along the freeway next to the port, which do have a metro line, which are the poorest and most highly non-white neighborhoods in Long Beach. All those green dots are where new housing is supposed to go. And the majority of it goes in the poorest, most at risk of displacement neighborhoods. Meanwhile, those lovely single family homes created with racial covenants, still lovely single family homes, those are too spread out for our transit aficionados. And so those red squares, that's where no new housing could go. Overwhelmingly wealthier and whiter. A VMT, vehicle mile travel reduction land use pattern. This is Ontario. Ontario is building out its southern area. This is the city. We're not talking about, you know, rural, whatever. This is the city of Ontario. Long planned is its build out location. All that area to the south is actually the second or third now highest selling home products in the nation. The majority of those homeowners are Latinos or other ethnic minorities. Homeowners have 77 times more wealth than renters, which is a stunning figure. And what the SCAG plan would have called for is stopping development of attainable home ownership in Southern Ontario, in blocks that have already been built out with streets and infrastructure, in favor of a transit-only, transit-first approach in the green dot areas along freeways, in again, the regions or the city's poorest, brownest neighborhoods. This is not long ago. This was last year. This is a VMT-centric land use plan. And the truth is, quote, no one was thinking about civil rights when we came up with this. That's not our job. We're the transit agency. And I'm telling you, the stuff you're doing now, even the congestion pricing and VMT fees that Hasan was talking about, look what's happened as a result of our land use policies. A little hard to see, but the purple neighborhoods, this is the Bay Area now, purple neighborhoods used to have pretty significant Black populations. Easier to track Blacks in the Census Bureau, by the way. Those Black populations have migrated to the green areas because housing is impossible. Impossible. What happens in the green areas? Well, the folks that are lucky enough to be out there, some would have bought homes. That's where I grew up, the green areas. At his peak, my dad made $29,000 a year at his peak. And they bought the house that we ended up in, not the first house we grew up in. But that house was $21,000. So some people moved out and gained wealth through home ownership. A lot of people moved out because they had no option to stay in. But they don't have a choice, everyone, about whether they drive or not. They have to drive. And they have to drive longer distances. So there is no way that these folks have a, quote, choice in their transportation model. They use the roads because that's how they have to move. And so charging them per mile traveled, even if they scrape together the money they need and get some subsidies to buy an electric car, charging them per mile is unthinkable. And what do I mean by them? I'm not talking about the very poor. I'm talking about middle-class Californians. And by middle class, I'm just talking about people who are making 60 to 80 grand a year. I'm not talking about, you know, the 300 grand household, which sometimes you hear about. You know, what is it? Biden's magic number is we don't want to charge anyone who makes less than $400,000. $400,000 is a ridiculous number to think of as, quote, middle class. What we're going after with a per mile VMT charge is the very same victims that we've created by this housing crisis. And the housing crisis, of course, is supercharged with tools like SQL, which we're still not fixing, that make it almost impossible to build new housing, especially in neighborhoods where there's people with money who don't want new people, sometimes called high opportunity areas. This is a redlining map of Oakland. The Oakland Hills are up at the top. They're green and yellow and blue. They're lovely. They were racially covenanted. The red areas were Black, Asian, Hispanic. And then to the right is the low VMT area, which is to say the same redlining neighborhoods, which is where we want to dump a bunch more housing and therefore cause a bunch more displacement. And it's like, oh, no, we have to protect. We have to protect against displacement. Well, how exactly are we doing that? We're not doing it well. We're just either not building housing or we're building housing and watching displacement occur. This is a bus ridership pre-COVID story, because in our zeal for innovation in all things, we somehow in the transportation industry and academic worlds continue to think that buses are a favored form of transit. They're not. As Hasan said, it's an app-based driven world, as the SCAG Sustainable Community Strategy itself says. Yeah, but union opposition and bureaucratic opposition to moving away from fixed route transit is too substantial to really adjust in any kind of time certain. But bus ridership has collapsed pre-COVID. And the idea that we're going to create buses, you know, lovely, try to get everyone within a half a mile of a bus or a bus stop. Where does that bus go? Does it go, you know, 13 miles to the job site at 4 p.m. when the shift starts? Does it come back at midnight? Does it allow for a drop-off of the kid on the way or a pickup? It's just not technology that reflects our lives today. And I totally agree with Hasan's comments on that. But it really does call into question our whole hub and spoke notion of what we're spending money in transportation on. So I'm going to actually just close with this comment. Well, one more, but we talk about environmental justice as though it's a pollution only issue. Environmental justice is part of the civil rights movement. It came a little later, but somehow we say environmental justice instead of civil rights, as though making it impossible for anyone to buy a home is a lawful activity for a California agency to engage in. It is not, and it is not enough to identify and consult with people called environmental justice advocates, with whom I have actually the greatest support. But it's not enough to consult with environmental justice and think you are engaging in legal civil rights activities, because you are siloing and ignoring every other form of health and, frankly, equity in disadvantaged communities. And I find it quite offensive that the environmental justice jargon has replaced civil rights as an excuse to ignore every other form of civil rights. What a myopic, arrogant, and condescendingly unlawful level that we've descended to in California. This is my last slide. The line shows reductions of tailpipe emissions in cars from the 1972 Clean Air Act enactment to almost nothing today. 99% of the worst smog-forming chemicals have been stripped by technologies we had no clue existed. Rare earth minerals to do with like catalytic converters. Who knew? When smog was first identified in LA, we thought actually it was poison gas from the Japanese during World War II. We have to be patient about our inability to learn. My dad used to tell me, for being so smart, you sure can be stupid sometimes. Your whole industry needs to realize, for being so smart, you sure can be stupid sometimes. And start listening really and thinking really about what families need and deserve in California. Because those purple bars, that's VMT. This is an Obama era map produced in 2016. VMT increases with population and employment, period. We're going to take a chunk out of it with remote work. We're going to see this nice little chunk. It'll be great. But otherwise, this kind of ride the bus, you know, build high rises and stick people in one-bedroom apartments costing $4,000 a month. It's an abomination, and it's happening today. And I'll close with that, Sarah.
Thank you, Jennifer. I read your article and my class read it, and it's just one of the most thought-provoking pieces I've read in a very long time. Thank you for putting it together. I wish more people would actually sit down and read it, and I just can't wait for the Q&A part of this. Thank you. Joe, I think we have your slides now.
That'd be great.
I know you just want to blow through them, so go for it.
Thank you so much. I'm ready. And I just want to say, Jennifer said she didn't think we would agree on many things. And I learned from her. We've been talking to each other in the last few years after a hiatus of several years. We both were working on long-range development plans for our campus years ago. But then she re-entered my life with these kinds of presentations in my course, and I have learned a lot from them. We all evolve in our understandings of what is equity. I'm going to chat. I'm not going to blow through these. I will take at least 10 or 15 minutes, and otherwise the students won't know what to ask me about. Although I'm sure they'll have questions for Jennifer. My interest on infrastructure and equity is longstanding, but in the sense of putting it in the context of contemporary concerns with environmental justice, it's more recent. I have been involved in developing ideas and looking at the history of American highways and what they have done to American cities, and the extent to which that has been inequitable has been clear to me for a long time. What has been less explicit is the relationships between explicit decision-making and injustice. I also am adding to my inventory a concern with climate change and racial justice that is different from the focus on urban freeways. If we have time, I would like to hear from the students about how they intend to integrate some of these perspectives into their work. Next slide, please. The focus on justice and urban planning and engineering is longstanding, but it is front and center, in part from because of some extremely well received recent materials, including by Richard Rothstein on the color of law, in which he summarizes, reminds us of the long history of truly racist activities that have come under the color of law and blessed and implemented by law. It is a shameful history, and his work and others are bringing it out to the fore. Next slide, please. What we engineers, planners, and lawyers do that has implications for urban infrastructure equity and environmental justice, we either do the background for, or plan or conceptualize or implement urban renewal projects, as they were once called, transportation systems, major transportation facilities like those on the slide, and in ways that many of us historically would not have thought were in any way focused on racial injustice. Next slide, please. The big projects, however, are not neutral. Where we put light rail routes and whether we put them in, as Jennifer said, where we put our waste facilities, where we put super trains, where we put infrastructure of other kinds. Next slide, please. For example, transfer stations. This is one in the Inland Empire. And on the one hand, it looks like a neutral decision on a major interstate freeway that is not highly populated. Well, maybe not so clear. Next slide, please. And how about the bullet train? Who's being served by this immensely expensive, immensely political infrastructure project, and who is not being served, and what are the opportunity costs of the billions of dollars going into that train? Next slide, please. The new infrastructure bill is something worth looking at. Here is a leader of the Black Caucus who helped get the multi-billion-dollar project through a few days ago. What does it include that relates to environmental justice and inclusion? Next slide, please. Well, many things. Some of you would perhaps not think of these elements as infrastructure, but they are now understood as part of the 2000s understanding of what it means to be to speak of infrastructure. And you can see some of them are what we're concerned about in this 2-hour program on infrastructure and equity. I'll just give a second for you to look at those and see the relative allocations among of the Congress in which President Biden will soon sign. Next slide, please. The one that I'll talk about now and that Sarah said I've written the book on, that's just because I did write the book on it, but others have as well. And that has to do with the infrastructure bill funding approaches to achieving solutions, or at least mitigating the effects of decisions that were made to build urban freeways from the late 1950s, and as they are still being built. That $1 billion may sound like a lot. It's a very big disappointment to the movement to remove, replace, cap, mitigate the effects of urban freeways. Next slide, please. This is the focus for the next few slides. What does it, what is involved in talking about equity and putting freeways through urban areas? Next slide, please. This is where I grew up, my old neighborhood. It was near the 15th Ward. The 15th Ward was Jewish and Black and Italian American. It was removed in order to put a freeway through the city of Syracuse. Why that route? Well, this is where what we're talking about becomes extremely sensitive and challenging. Were the state and local transportation planners and the local governments motivated by removing Blacks from the inner city? Or was that just what happened? Next slide, please. In many of the urban freeway decisions, one can find, and we did find in our work on changing lanes, which I wrote with a Clemson professor, that you could find specific assertions, specific evidence that these decisions were made to remove Blacks from the inner city, to disperse them, to remove what was considered slums by decision maker, what were considered in many areas viable minority communities in others. An early case of how this could have been done differently is seen on this slide, the Caltrans Century 105 case. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Let's just move through these quickly. We could talk about history if you have questions later, but I want to get to the Century Freeway. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. This is what the freeways were conceived of as looking at, this as looking like. This is a parkway, I think, in the Northeast. And people thought that this is what was going to be meandering in leafy, verdant areas through downtown Syracuse or Milwaukee or Hollywood. That's not, of course, what happened. Next slide. Next slide. If you want to get a sense of how people envision these freeways going through cities, not as ways of removing the 15th Ward or minority groups, but as ways of envisioning a modern, seamlessly integrated commercial and transportation set of systems. The slide before, and don't go back to it, but if you look at these slides later and go onto the YouTube, you see the World's Fair of 1939 looking to the future and in a remarkable way depicting how the urban freeway would bring happiness and joy to the world. Next slide. The approach, and this is interesting in light of the conclusions that we saw in the first part of the program of congestion pricing and paying for freeways, the history of urban freeways was one that moved from toll roads to free roads and led to a much lesser political opposition to freeways than would have been the case, as has been the case in California when some of our freeways moved to toll roads. Next slide, please. What is involved here is the question of who made those decisions. Part of it, of course, is what were the motivations of the people who made those. But the major point with regard to how things came out were the question of who were the players, who were involved, and most importantly, who were not involved. And those who were not involved were minority people, were people of color, low and moderate income people. In our case studies, you'll see that the decision makers were proud of the fact that all groups in society were involved in the analysis of whether the freeway should go through Baltimore or Miami or Le in New Orleans. All those people meant the American Automobile Association, the Chamber of Commerce, not the NAACP, for example. Next slide, please. The freeways that we highlight in the book, Changing Lanes, Visions and Histories of Urban Freeways, are the three on the right. On the left, our cameo is a list of a large number of cities that were impacted by freeways. And some of these, there is evidence, and that's not our work, but evidence of racially motivated decision-making to remove from the center city African Americans. Next slide, please. I won't talk about Syracuse unless that question comes up. I want to move to the next slide. This is the yellow book, which was the book that transportation engineers at the federal level developed for the United States of America, where freeways would go. And it was called the Yellow Book because these maps were printed in a yellow book, and they were based on the notion that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And so a freeway going from Modesto to San Diego went through Los Angeles, and a freeway that went from Canada to Pennsylvania went through the city of Syracuse, and a freeway that went from the north to the south went through one of the most beloved parks of Memphis, Tennessee. Next slide, please. But let's think about inclusion and what can be done right. This is the Century Freeway Corridor before and after. The Century Freeway covers 10 jurisdictions that go almost from LAX to Downey. And this was a viable middle-class community that was chosen to be the site of Caltrans' next major freeway, the Century 105. Well, the Century 105 program ran up against a new approach to designing and implementing freeways that is a revolution in freeway policy. Next slide, please. The freeway of the century, or the last urban freeway, or the freeway with a heart, the century has been called all of these things, implemented many of the ideas that are part of the new thinking the last few years about infrastructure development. Participation would involve those who would be affected by the freeway. Advisory committees were created. These advisory committees were involved in working face-to-face and in equal plane with Caltrans engineers. Employment opportunities were mandated. Those who lived in the urban freeway path would be given opportunities to work on the freeway. And in fact, there were requirements for women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses. Housing would be required, and housing only could, the freeway could only be built when housing was made available for those who had been displaced by the Century Freeway. So after 10 years of litigation involving the Center for Law and the Public Interest, the freeway went forward. Not the dream that some of us would have hoped for, but a freeway that was much different in its impacts than it would have been as compared to the original plans. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. One of the reasons that the freeway looked like it did is, unlike Syracuse and unlike some of the earlier urban freeways, the public interest law and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the corridor cities were able to take advantage of the revolution in regulatory law that occurred in the United States in the 60s and 70s. Section 4 of the Department of Transportation Act, the National Historical Preservation Act, the Federal Aid Highway Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, and relocation laws that allowed public interest groups and governments who were interested in softening and making more acceptable urban freeways the tools to slow down, influence the design, and in some cases ultimately stop the movement of freeways through cities that displaced thousands of low-income and minority people throughout the United States prior to the passage of these laws. Next slide, please. That is a very quick overview of my focus on freeways. One of the other areas that we can talk about in the discussion, and I truly want to stop after one more point, is to get our thoughts on the roles we play as lawyers and planners and transportation engineers in making more inclusive the infrastructure of our society. The one area that I left out earlier was the impact of the decisions on infrastructure that has been felt by minority communities in terms of climate change. The New York Times and others have done extensive studies showing that low and moderate income communities lack the parks and the access to open space that are available throughout more wealthier communities, and link that to actual temperature increases of 1 or 2 degrees, making for even less bearable summers in some of the inner cities of the United States. I'm sorry I moved so quickly, but we were running out of time. And as we all want to hear what the students say and try to respond very quickly, I hope, to any questions they have.
Well, thank you so much. I thought that was fascinating, and I'm really glad you were able to share the presentation. So thank you for that. I find this kind of interesting. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg ended up in a back and forth with U.S. Senator Ted Cruz these last few days.
Yep.
The secretary
roads is racist roads. Yeah.
So the secretary noted that systemic racism in the design and location of highways in American cities and suburbs continue to adversely affect low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. He must have read some of your books.
I did send it to him, and he thanked me.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Oh, I think that's fabulous. I bet he did. Anyway, Senator Cruz sarcastically tweeted, "The roads are racist and we must get rid of roads." And I thought the secretary's response was very gentle and perfect. And he said, if people in 2021 are suffering from a discriminatory policy funded by the federal government, then we have a responsibility to fix it. And I don't know who it hurts to acknowledge that harm was done and to propose doing something to fix it. So hopefully it's caught the attention of some of our leaders. But that leads me to a question for you, Joe. And that is, which attempts at redoing old urban freeways are most likely to promote equity and foster inclusion and connectedness?
That's a great question. It's being debated right now. I'm in upstate New York now. I'm on sabbatical, and the Interstate 81 is being, it's been in discussion for 10 years, but it is going to be removed in the central core. And now part of the question being raised by the predominantly African-American community is, will we be gentrified? Will we be put in a situation where the freeway is removed, fancy stores come in, the kind of housing that Jennifer was speaking about, very high income, and will again move us away. So I think what fosters inclusion is what's happening here is involve the community in design decisions. One decision, for example, that is being debated is, should there be a roundabout rather than a split level street? And that had implications for air pollution in the schools within the central city. So I think participation is an immensely important element of this. I think inclusion also comes from connectivity. In Washington, DC now, I've been consulting with groups who are thinking about approaches to capping the major freeway that goes into downtown DC. And the question is, if you cap them and make a park, are you going to be increasing the connectivity between those communities that are now predominantly African-American and those that are not? And so looking at ways of connectivity through the approach that you use. So removing freeway is can be a way of promoting connectivity. Capping them can be a way as well.
Interesting. Jennifer, I hope you're still on. Are you?
Her picture is.
I know.
I am.
Hi. I don't know if you heard Hasan's comments, but one of the things he said, which I thought was intriguing, and I would love to hear what you have to say. And then I think if Professor McNally is still on, he wanted to say something too. But he said, congestion pricing is good for all of us. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that's nonsense. You know, we've systematically destroyed legacy minority communities that were much more proximate to jobs and forced people to commute longer and longer distances. You have to drive till you qualify. The Bay Area, which is kind of the heart of this smart no growth attitude, created more super commuters than any region in the country pre-COVID. And so the idea that it's kind of like, what would be a good analogy? Yeah, I'm not going to come up with a politically correct one, so I'll abandon that. But you're taking those most victimized by the housing crisis who've lost their communities, literally lost their communities, lost their churches, lost their grandmother's house, lost their schools, lost their neighbors because they can't afford to stay where they once were. Those are the people who we're now going to decide have to pay the most. And Hasan's idea, which is always is presented as like, well, let's socially engineer around that and find a cutoff of low-income people that won't have to pay. So that won't include, and frankly shouldn't include, folks like teachers and firemen. And yet those are the people who are doing those long commutes now. Some have resorted to, renting travel trailers or couch surfing so they can take a night or two off and not have to drive that long distance, but they can't afford housing closer in. Then you start saying, oh, well, we need to subsidize housing. And before you know it, you've kind of created this new vision of like, this time we'll get socialism right, trust us. Because you can't just keep pulling all kinds of weird levers and hope that political people will not do what political people always do, which is stuff like taking cap and trade dollars for high-speed rail. Are you serious? You think this is reducing greenhouse gas? It was a political decision. So you hand a bunch of money to bureaucrats who get to decide where the money goes, and they'll spend it on their own projects that they like and that their stakeholders like. And so we have the same ideas around, protecting ratepayers for utility, high utility fees. And the truth is, the poverty rates now to qualify for assistance for electricity bills that in the summer in the Central Valley go up to like $1,000 a month for people to have air conditioning so they can live, right? This is, let's not blame everything on climate change. It's always been a little hot in the Central Valley, but now we're charging $1,000 a month. They're not qualifying for low income assistance. They're making 60 grand a year, 80 grand a year, but they can't afford to stay here. And so they're, we're hollowing out our middle class. What's that look like? It doesn't look like we're going to pay more people at McDonald's. It looks like we'll have more of those little self-directed kiosk thingies where you don't have 3 kids from high school working the counter. You have screens and you still have, people working the back rooms. So honestly, there's a lot of pointy-headed academics and really deeply white environmentalists who have no clue and are continuing today to inflict harm on communities of color at the most massive scale with zero accountability.
Joe, do you have anything you want to add to that? And then I see Mike McNally has joined us on the screen, so hopefully he can add to this conversation.
I'd like to hear Michael's comment and any students as well.
Okay. Mike is a professor of civil engineering, very involved in the Institute of Transportation Studies. We actually did invite him to be on this panel and he thought he would be too controversial. So he declined.
Mike, I got you, man.
Well, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because I can't see my picture or not. I was not planning on speaking. In fact, I posted a couple emails to some of you, but Jennifer, if I might call you Jennifer, yeah, what you just said, you definitely got me because I really agree with almost everything you said. I did want to point out that there was a comment I was going to make about congestion pricing that was an agreement with you, not so much conflicting what else was said, other than the fact that there is a huge privacy issue there. By saying that people are willing to use Netflix or to charge their Tesla and not worry about being tracked, doesn't deny the fact that they are being tracked. And if you're going to have something that's going to be priced, that's going to follow your car, not even looking at the technology cost of doing so, you are going to be tracked. Is it any worse or better? No, but it's still the same thing. So privacy is a big issue and it's only going to get worse as far as that goes. And it depends on who you go tracking. And the other issue that didn't come up was the idea that this idea of even taking congestion pricing fees and putting it toward better transit or something like that, it just smacks of separate but equal for me.
Yep, I would agree.
Thank you. Joe, should I just go into some of the questions that the students are asking? Okay. What are some things California should address in order to measure civil rights along with environmental justice and greenhouse gas reductions in its climate success metric?
Well, so that's really a great question, which I love because it starts, the rot starts at the top of the climate movement and measures how much greenhouse gas we create in California. and results in, you know, how when we, during the drought, you're supposed to like use less water, right? One of the most effective ways our household would have used less water is exporting our teenage son. We would have gone way down in showers and whatnot. California's climate metric counts greenhouse gas produced, say, from a ton of cement, which we need to build housing, as like a major source of greenhouse gas. Oh my goodness, we can't have that. That same ton of cement, if it's created with a coal-fired grid in China and transported across the oceans with bunker fuel, and then, you know, with diesel-powered trucks comes to the site where it's finally going to pour the foundation of a new house, our climate geniuses have said that's zero greenhouse gas. Isn't it lovely? Because we don't make it here. So we need a per capita or per product metric for greenhouse gas. And that is very, very different. So for example, Sustainable Conservation, a really great environmental group I'm on the board of, and I tend to be on environmental group boards, by the way, has just measured greenhouse gas per gallon of milk. And we have the most efficient greenhouse gas per gallon of milk production rate in the world. So let's figure out why that is and whether we can reduce greenhouse gas further in California, but also encourage everybody to reduce greenhouse gas associated with milk production. That's a good thing. We can do that. Per capita GHG is very low along the coast. Why? It's low because we drive, shorter distances. We have more educated, wealthy people who can stay at home and work on their keyboards, and because we have a temperate climate. Okay, what do we do about taking that lesson and applying it everywhere else? Well, one thing we should do is take the 80 or 85% of permanent open space preservation land in Marin, which is used to graze cows, and take 5,000 acres and put 20,000 people there. That's an incredibly efficient and effective and frankly equitable greenhouse gas solution for California. And I'm picking it because it's the whitest, wealthiest county in the state, and it was just busted for intentionally segregating its public schools 2 years ago. They deserve to have some cows removed and some people imported. But you have to actually start thinking about this as though you want to solve greenhouse gas and climate change, as opposed to pander to every no growth, idea ever cooked up by overwhelmingly white people in the climate movement. And you have to realize that environmental justice and civil rights are measured by things like home ownership rates, by things like income differentials between different ethnicity, even in things like actual population. The Bay Area, which is the most, I think, racially segregated of our major regions, has half as many Latinos as the state as a whole, and a lot less than half as Southern California. Because who can stay there? Not my family, they've moved. I mean, this is it's not hard to measure civil rights successes. You just have to decide you want to do it. And once you decide you want to do it, you have to realize you've been blowing it big time. And that means acknowledging mistakes. The governor's current secretary for climate acknowledged she made a big mistake. The whole kind of, count GHG only that's produced here is a flawed metric. She said it on the record. But, the machine is not kind to younger, browner people.
Joe, do you have anything you want to add to that, or?
I would just add that the slight progress we've made in the last year with regard to removing obstacles to affordable housing needs to be made much greater. And affordable housing densification in areas that are on the coast and are so capable of avoiding compliance with their fair share of housing, that's an area that we need to target. And that has benefits that are for the specific clients that we're talking about, but it also has benefits for greenhouse gases, as people can live closer to where they work and take advantage of the transportation options that come with densification.
I'm sorry to disagree with you, but I do. And I base that on Judge Carter's decision on the homeless catastrophe in Los Angeles, where he said the quote, affordable housing production machine isn't just slow. It's spending $500,000 per unit, and it's mostly serving white, formerly homeless people, as opposed to the predominantly communities of color that actually suffer from homelessness. There's rot in the affordable housing production system that's deep, and Judge Carter's decision is astounding.
Yeah, I don't see how you're disagreeing with me. I'm saying we need to remove obstacles to creating affordable housing and densifying housing in areas that have been opposed to it for so long.
And here's a question that I think is really interesting. Would regional decision-making be better if we took away housing and infrastructure decisions from municipalities and brought it to an NGO? And
oh God, yeah, because I have such confidence in our environmental NGOs that have created our current catastrophe. You want to de-democratize California and the United States? I gotta say, I'm absolutely opposed. This Berkeley Democrat is like, I'm not going down that path. I don't trust any nonprofit, and I certainly don't trust the government more than I trust the voters. So, and I'm also getting kicked out of my room, so I'm gonna actually get tossed. Please, everyone, get out of your silos. Stop being so white. Go talk to moms, you know, who are like at the grocery store where Spanish is the most predominant language, and ask them if they want to give up their cars, what their life would be like. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to
Good to see you.
thank you, Jennifer.
Nice to see you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye. And Joe, do you have anything you want to add to that? Or
this question about whether things with regard to equity and the other outcomes we're concerned with would be improved by regional governance. That's one question. Yes, it hasn't been done well throughout the United States. It hasn't been done throughout the United States. And part of the problem is that our regional governments do not have the authority that comes with municipal, of the kind that municipal governments had. If we moved it up to the municipal zoning, planning and zoning authority up to a regional level, and we only come, we don't come near to doing that, I'm afraid that the pressures that have pushed for local control and are exclusionary would maybe just move up one level. I do think we should try to move in the direction of increasing the power of regional agencies. I do not, and I agree with Jennifer on this, think that that means we put it in the hands of any particular non-governmental organization. These are government decisions that have to represent the views of the electorate, not of what an NGO thinks is best for society.
Thank you for that. And there are several questions that are directed specifically to Jennifer. And what I'd like to tell those attendees that wrote those questions, I will send them on to Jennifer and then send you all the responses. We have one last question, which I think is an outstanding question, Joe. And it says, as emerging professionals, how do we ensure that the companies and governments we work for are not contributing to the racist climate, transportation, and housing policies? And if that is not avoidable, how do we work to combat these problems from within our workplace?
Fabulous question, difficult question.
Yes.
One of my very best students ever, whom I think would have done good things from working within the system, absolutely has refused to take any position with an entity that doesn't meet his very strict standards of inclusivity and equity. As emerging professionals, I think you need to do your homework well as to what is greenwash or good talk or marketing versus what the actual results have been on the part of the corporation or local government. Local governments can tend to be as exclusionary and as inequitable as many corporations, to see what their actual report cards look like. Secondly, when you're in interviews, make it clear to them, and it's easy for me to say this, but make it clear to them that this is a two-way street. I'm looking to see whom I want to work for, not just trying to be attractive to you independent of what your equity profile is. So, and I hope you have those opportunities to choose among them. Thirdly, I always say to my law students who don't want, some of whom will not work for a private firm or will not work for a government that they don't think meets their standards, give it a try, because you learn from within, your views become a little bit more sophisticated, and you may find that you are more attractive to a company or a government that is more in keeping with your values when they see you have had this experience. The private sector experience can be quite valuable in terms of learning the various perspectives on some of these social justice issues.
Well said. Thank you so much. I don't think I was aware, or if I was aware, I forgot that you were on sabbatical. So it's even more meaningful to me that you decided to be with us today. Thank you so much. So wonderful.
Oh, Sarah, I'm honored that you asked me.
Well, we're honored that you took the time to do this for us. And everybody, we need to all read Joe's books. So also, I think it'd be so fun if you wrote back to the Secretary of Transportation regarding this debate he's having with the senator, and just say, oh, I see you read my book or something like that. I just think that'd be very fun. If you do that and you get a response, please share it with us.
Okay, I definitely will.
And I want to thank Dr. Ritchie and ITS and everybody for making this possible. And very, very, very thought-provoking. So both you and Jennifer.
Thanks to all the students who participated. It's 2 hours of hard thinking.
But exciting. I thought it was one of the most exciting discussions I've heard in a long time. So thank you, everybody.
Take good care. And
Bye.
Thanks for your technical assistance.
Well, that was Jared. Thank you, Jared.
Thank you. Bye-bye.